Welcome again to Holistic Triathlon, my YouTube vlog about triathlon training and everything related that might interest you, be it nutrition, gadgets, well-being, recovery, or all kinds of other related topics. In today's episode, I would like to discuss a little bit heart rate-based training, especially when it comes to running. As this indicates, I will at some point of time upload some episodes about heart rate related training when it comes to cycling and swimming, but today's focus is solely on running because I think here heart rate has actually most relevance when it comes to monitoring your training, and is definitely something that I know a lot of you are still taking into consideration and looking at when training. When we're talking about monitoring your running progress or your running performance of heart rate, we first and foremost have to talk a little bit about equipment. And I would like to quickly give you an introduction to the equipment I use on a daily basis when I go out for runs. So first and foremost, I have, of course, my heart rate sensor here, my Garmin watch. It's a Forerunner 735 XT, rather an older model, but does it totally for me in terms of measuring my distance, protocoling my training, and giving me a basic indication with the heart rate. However, it's infrared based, measuring the heart rate here at the wrist of my hand. And actually, I think much is written about it. It's not the most accurate or precise way of measuring your heart rate. Sometimes it simply jumps, sometimes it simply is deviating too much from how your heart rate actually is going. And especially for high intensity training, interval training, etc., it is simply not accurate enough for me. So I invested also in Garmin's external Triathlon heart rate belt, which I'm also using for my running training together with the watch. It's paired. So actually for monitoring my heart rate, I rely basically on the heart rate belt, which is much more accurate and much more precise. So that is a small extra investment of €100, $100 respectively, which I think is very, very valuable for you. Further, when it comes to running training, I am actually somebody who relies mostly on pace-based training. So I do a lot of training by saying, for example, okay, I should do a threshold session today and I should run X amount of kilometers in a pace of 4 minutes per kilometer. And how I determine my training and plan my training is based on Jack Daniels' running formula, which is, in my opinion, one of the best scientific books ever written about running training and how to structure it, how to plan it. So that is basically what I rely on. I'm very much like a pace kind of guy who says, okay, I have to run X intervals in that pace today, and that is what I try to stick to. However, I also control my training progress and my training performance by relying on Stride. As you can see here on the shoe, I have the small GPS sensor, the small power meter sensor from Stride here, which is an amazing add-on to my training protocoling and my training structure. I think it came very much to everybody's attention because some of the Norwegian triathletes like Christian Blumfeld and Gustav Iden are relying heavily on their Stride data and using that in everyday training sessions. It's technology that is now more than 10 years under development, very great tool, not only measuring watt and speed and distance, but also all kinds of running technique, performance parameters like vertical oscillations, stride lengths, your responsive power, your ground contact time, etc. So that is also a very nice add-on. And I use all these insights together to monitor my running training, but heart rate is of course also something that comes into my training every day. Quick disclaimer that simply there are some things that I will say now, in the next couple of minutes, might be super boring for people who have read a lot about heart rate, etc. So my tip is quite simple. I try to structure the videos here as good as possible into chapters so that you can jump from chapter to chapter and decide what might be interesting to you or what might not be interesting to you. So if there's something where you say, I heard this over and over again, just go forward to the next chapter, see if there's some interesting or valuable content for you. As I said initially, I want to try to make the videos in a way that beginners, intermediate triathlete, but also maybe more experienced triathlete really get some value out of them. So let's start first and foremost quickly giving a recap about the heart rate based training method. What is it about? So our heart rate, basically that is a beats per minute our heart is pounding with, and of course the faster we run, the more intense we run, the faster our heart is pounding and transporting O2 to our cells and transporting CO2 out of our cells. So basically, that is a very good indicator of how much effort we are doing and how much performance we are doing in a certain moment. But it is an indicator that has certain restrictions. First and foremost, when it comes to planning your training, you have to know your maximum heart rate. And knowing your maximum heart rate is very easily determined by doing a very challenging heart rate test. So you can simply go on a track and, for example, run a mile as fast as you can. A kilometer will probably do too if you really give it an all out. So that is really running 1 kilometer as fast as you can until you really, when you finish the kilometer, you have to fall to the ground and you're breathing heavily and you have this like feeling of like iron taste in your throat because you just overdid it so much. That is exactly the feeling that you need, and the heart rate that you will have there towards the end of this test is very approximately your maximum heart rate. What you then might find out is that your maximum heart rate might deviate quite much from the standard formulas. You see there are some standard formulas out there to estimate your maximum heart rate without doing a test. One very classic, very typical formula is 220 minus your age. And this is a formula that is based on a big population. So if you have like 10,000 people and you take their age and you take the 220 value and deduct for each person the age from the 220, then for a certain amount of these people, this will estimate their maximum heart rate pretty precisely. However, how it is with normal populations, you have always a normal distribution. And if you are one of the few unlucky ones who is maybe like 1 standard deviation or 2 standard deviations from this average, then this formula will not work at all for you. I'm, for example, like somebody where you see a slight but very important deviation. I'm 32 now. And if I would deduct my 32 years of age from the 220, I would end at a maximum heart rate of 188. However, when I did my last running test, my maximum heart rate is actually about 202 when I'm doing high intensity or maximum running efforts, which means a deviation of 14 beats per minute for maximum heart rate. And this could have significant effects for estimating my training zones, as you can understand, because it is a significant deviation, nearly 7% of what the formula would give me and what my real heart rate is like to be. So my recommendation is clearly, if you want to work with heart rate at all, do a maximum test, do a 1 kilometer, 1.6 kilometer test and really give it an all out, and what you achieve there will be your maximum heart rate. You can then use your maximum heart rate to define different training zones, clearly. However, I want to say clearly that I am not much in favor of training with these training zones in your everyday life. There's a lot of like definitions written about it, how you put your maximum heart rate or convert it to different training zones, and you can easily apply that and try to define your aerobic zone, your anaerobic zone, your threshold zone, your interval zone, etc. However, there are certain constraints that you have to take into consideration when it comes to using heart rate for running training in general, when you want to define your running pace zones based on your heart rate. First and foremost, external circumstances can vary greatly. That is, for example, when it's very hot outside, your heart rate will automatically be higher. I experienced this last time when I was in Los Angeles training in the area there a couple of weeks ago. And we were in the middle of a heat wave, so we had regularly 30, 32 degrees. And when you go out in the morning on the bike, you could already see that my resting heart rate was simply 15 to even 20 beats higher than normal, just because it was so hot already at 8 a.m. in the morning. So this means, of course, that all your heart rate values are higher. This does not necessarily mean that you can push less watts or have a less of a power output on the bike, but your heart rate values will be totally off. So if you try to control in these conditions your interval training with your heart rate, you will perform way too slow compared to what you actually should do, simply because the heat affects your body so much. Sleep deprivation can also be a factor that affects your heart rate pretty much. So can be, for example, excess caffeine intakes that will drive your heart rate up. So there are like many external factors that affect your heart rate greatly and therefore make it sometimes a little bit imprecise to work with it. The second problem that I see with heart rate is, and that is described very much in literature, especially when it comes to cycling and to power-based cycling methods, that is that heart rate is a reactive measure of performance. And reactive means in that regard, heart rate is always really a little bit delayed. If you look here on the side, I have an example from my latest 5-kilometer test that I did, where you see very nicely that both the power and the pace, of course, started its minute where the test started to be high, and I kept it also quite consistent. But you can see that my heart rate actually took a long time to climb up gradually until it reached at some point of time a plateau which was close to maximum heart rate that then was held for like the second half of this all-out 5-kilometer effort. And that is a classic pattern we see with heart rate all over again. So heart rate had simply the problem that once you start pushing yourself, heart rate reacts delayed. And if you now imagine, for example, that you do a session of 10 times 400 meters, there you simply see you do the first 400 meter interval, the heart rate maybe after half the interval starts to go up. It goes also like super much up towards the end of the interval. Then you have a resting period. You might jog 200 meters or a minute or something like that before you start the next interval. The heart rate drops, and then you repeat this pattern. Every time the heart rate will get a little bit higher with every interval in best case, but still if you then compare the time that you spend at this high intensity heart rate zone that you protocol your training with, and for example the time that you actually ran at a certain pace or at a certain wattage, you will see a deviation. Yeah, in this case, for example, where we did the 10 times 400, let's assume we do them at 1 minute 30 per 400 meters. It might be that we ran them totally consistent with the right power output that we should run for making it a hard training session. And also time-wise, we ran very consistent. So we spent actually 15 minutes in total in the right power zone to really give a good stress on our body. However, you see with the heart rate, because it's so delayed, we might only have spent 10 minutes in the right heart rate zone. So what is now the measure that you should use to protocol and monitor your training? Does this mean you spend 5 minutes less in the right zone that you actually wanted to spend in? No, absolutely not. Because heart rate is reactive and always is delayed, we cannot use heart rate in this regard to protocol our training. We simply have to rely on the time we spent in the intensity zone and the watt output that we had. And that is what drives our training. You know this very well from cycling, but from running, it is exactly the same story, exactly the same fact, and you can easily see this in your own interval training. Therefore, I really love to use the stride in interval sessions because it gives me really much like an accurate picture of how much watt I'm putting in from the very first second when I start an interval. That being said, is there at all a place for heart rate in running training? As I said, I will come to swimming training and cycling training in different videos. But speaking of running training, I think there is absolute relevance for heart rate. Definitely, for example, one of the things that we hear over and over again, measuring fatigue, is something that is very, very efficiently controlled by heart rate. Or maybe, for example, if you get a cold or something like that. I really, really like to do consistent easy sessions. So I do like 2 times a week, at least, if not 3 times, a very easy running session, mostly in the morning, mostly at the same point of time, which is a 7 to 8 kilometer running session that takes me between 35 and 42 minutes. So it's something in a pace between 5 minutes per kilometer, 5:20, 5:30. So really, really easy, really relaxed, just to build up my aerobic capacity, to collect some kilometers in zone 1. Very nice standard measure for me. And I'm doing this 2 to 3 times every week of my training. And if I see here, for example, despite running a slow and controlled pace, if I see here like an incredible jump in heart rate suddenly, let's say I did it last week in something like 70% of my maximum heart rate, and now suddenly I'm at 80 at a specific day. Then I ask myself, okay, am I tired today? I'm asking myself, what did I do yesterday? Oh, I did hard intervals on the bike. Okay, it's natural, my body is very tired and the heart rate is high. If I then say, oh, but I was actually resting the last 2 days, then I would start to think about, Am I on the way to get sick? Did I have a bad night's sleep? Did I have a scratch in my throat in the morning or something like that? So you can use this to assess your live session today and get an idea, are you in the best shape or are you actually in a bad shape, and should you maybe consider having additional rest sessions, or should you maybe really monitor if you're getting sick or similar. Another way, and this goes again hand in hand with these easy 7 to 8 kilometer sessions I do 2 to 3 times a week, because I measure my power output, because I measure my pace, and I know the distance, and it's always the same round. It's always the same round in the neighborhood I have. So there's no big problems with changing winds or with hills or something like that. It's a very nice flat wind protected round I have, and I'm running that every week multiple times. And if I bring all this data together, especially if I bring the development of my watt versus my heart rate together, you can see in this graph here in the picture that I can see, in best case, a correlation between the watt output that hopefully goes up slightly or at least stays consistent. Yeah? So my power output stays consistent or goes up, so I'm getting stronger, while at the same time the heart rate, the average heart rate for my training sessions hopefully slowly decreases from month to month. And this is a fantastic indicator for aerobic sessions. If you have like sessions in zone 1, maybe in zone 2, where you simply can monitor, okay, here is progress at work. Okay, I can see I hold the same power is increasing. At the same time, my heart rate is dropping from month to month on average. This is basically showing, okay, you are getting fitter. So something of the training that you're doing is really, really positively adapted in your body, and it's a fantastic measure, especially in the low intensities, to see if you are moving in the right direction. So this is so much as a quick summary how I use heart rate in my training. Of course, that being said again, it is a very cheap method for you to get started. However, if you are serious about your running training, if you really want to make big jumps forward, I think you have to do some additional investments, unfortunately. Definitely the heart rate belt that I mentioned at the beginning, which makes heart rate, especially when it comes to interval training, much more accurate. But also the stride sensor that costs about $200 is, in my opinion, an absolutely must-have for most runners. Not only to measure your training progress efficiently, but also to measure a lot of aspects of your technique, etc. So that is my summary for today about this topic. I hope you enjoyed it. Give me a like or subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments or directly in a personal message what you think, what your perspective on these topics are, and then I hope to see you also for the next video where I share some additional insights. Have a great day. Bye bye.